The 2030 World Cup is still 4 years away, and it's already shaping up to be one of the most chaotic, contested tournaments in the competition's history. 6 countries, 3 continents, a dispute over which country even gets to host the final, animal welfare controversies, racism allegations, a commercial fight with FIFA's own president that's now threatening whether some of the host nations even show up. This isn't speculation. Every single one of these problems is already real, already public, and already unresolved, sitting in headlines right now rather than hypothetical scenarios somebody's imagining 4 years out. Let's go through everything actually wrong with the 2030 World Cup, one issue at a time, starting with the basic structure of the tournament itself, because this is genuinely unprecedented. The 2030 World Cup will be staged primarily across Spain, Portugal, and Morocco, who will host the overwhelming majority of matches. But to mark the tournament's 100th anniversary, the very first World Cup was played in Uruguay back in 1930, FIFA decided to also award ceremonial opening matches to Uruguay, Argentina, and Paraguay. That makes 2030 the first World Cup in history to be played across 6 different countries, spanning 3 separate continents. On paper, that's a nice symbolic tribute to the tournament's history. In practice, it's already creating real logistical headaches. Originally, Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay, and Chile had been pursuing their own separate, standalone bid to host the centenary tournament entirely, with a final potentially played in Montevideo, the same city that hosted the first ever final a century earlier. That bid made a lot of sense on its own terms. South America hadn't hosted a World Cup since Brazil in 2014, and putting the 100th anniversary tournament back where it all started had real symbolic weight. Instead, FIFA carved that history-making element down to 3 single opening matches, bolted onto a tournament otherwise run entirely by Spain, Portugal, and Morocco. It's a compromise that satisfied almost nobody completely. South America gets a token nod rather than the full centenary hosting they wanted, while fans of the actual main host nations now have to explain why their World Cup technically kicks off on a different continent entirely. Think about what that actually means for supporters trying to plan around this tournament. A fan following their national team could, in theory, need to travel to South America for an opening match and then fly clear across the Atlantic to Europe or North Africa for the rest of the tournament, all within the same competition. That's an entirely new category of logistical complexity that no previous World Cup has ever asked of its fans. And it's happening specifically because FIFA tried to satisfy 2 competing centenary claims: Spain, Portugal, and Morocco's actual hosting bid, and South America's symbolic claim to the tournament's origins, rather than picking one clean approach and committing to it fully. Then there's the fight over stadiums, which is still completely unresolved as of right now. The preliminary bid submitted by Spain, Portugal, and Morocco included venues from all 3 countries, but the final list of which stadiums actually get used has not been confirmed. FIFA and the organizing committee are expected to present that final roster in October, and in the meantime, each country is fighting to hold on to as many of their own venues as possible. Morocco's argument is that the European hosts can't reasonably be expected to handle the bulk of the tournament alone, and that Morocco therefore needs to keep all 6 of its proposed stadiums in the final plan. Spain's counterargument focuses partly on comfort and safety for traveling fans and players, raising specific concerns about the practicality of playing matches in Morocco, given the conditions there. That disagreement gets even more pointed when you get to the biggest prize of all, where the final itself is actually played. Multiple reports have laid out 3 realistic scenarios currently on the table: Real Madrid's Santiago Bernabeu, Barcelona's Camp Nou, or Casablanca in Morocco, which has made clear it wants the historic first World Cup final of the tournament's second century to be played on its own soil. Spanish Football Federation President Rafael Luzán has been blunt about Spain's position. essentially arguing that it would be almost impossible to justify the World Cup final not being hosted in Spain. That's about as direct a staking out of territory as you'll see between two co-hosts of the same tournament. And with the final venue decision still pending, this is genuinely one of the more contentious unresolved fights in the entire bid. It's worth pointing out just how unusual it is for co-hosts to be fighting this openly, this far in advance, over which country gets the crown jewel fixture of the entire tournament. In previous multi-country World Cups and continental tournaments, host nations have typically worked out final venue arrangements relatively quietly, well before public figures started making the kind of blunt, borderline dismissive comments Luzon has made about Morocco's chances. The fact that Spain's own federation president is willing to say, on the record, that it would essentially be unjustifiable for anyone other than Spain to host the final tells you just how much genuine tension already exists beneath the surface of what's supposed to be a cooperative three-nation partnership. Now, layer onto all of that a completely separate controversy, the proposal to expand this exact tournament from 48 teams to 64, specifically as a one-time gesture to mark the centenary. On the surface, more countries getting a chance to play in a World Cup sounds like a good thing. In practice, critics argue this makes an already complicated six-country, three-continent hosting plan even harder to manage, straining logistics further, undermining the actual quality of matches on the pitch, and adding even more strain to a player workload that's already been a major point of tension between FIFA and Europe's domestic leagues for years. Some confederations, like CONMEBOL, have actually championed the idea, framing it as an opportunity for global growth and more qualification chances for smaller footballing nations. But plenty of others, including player representatives worried about burnout, have pushed back hard, arguing the expansion serves FIFA's commercial interests far more than it serves the actual quality or integrity of the competition. And that expansion fight isn't happening in isolation either. It's landing right in the middle of the biggest governance crisis FIFA has faced in years. Remember the FIFA Forward Enterprise Plan? Infantino's proposal to sell a 20% stake in FIFA's commercial rights to outside private investors in a deal reportedly worth around $4.2 billion against a $20 billion valuation. That plan collapsed after fierce opposition from multiple confederations, but the damage it did to trust between FIFA and Europe's federations didn't collapse along with it. Multiple European federations, Wales among the first, have already formally withdrawn their support for Infantino's re-election bid over exactly this dispute, and UEFA itself has gone as far as threatening legal action. And here's the part that connects directly back to 2030. Spain and Portugal are both UEFA members, and their commitment to UEFA's collective position in this ongoing dispute means that if the crisis between FIFA and UEFA keeps escalating, there's now a real possibility they simply don't participate in FIFA tournaments at all while it's unresolved. Given that Spain and Portugal are two of the three primary hosts of the 2030 World Cup, that's not a small abstract governance dispute anymore. It's a genuine threat to the tournament they're supposed to be co-hosting in 4 years' time. Think about what that would actually mean in practice. Two of the three countries responsible for building stadiums, running the logistics, and welcoming the world, potentially sitting out the competitive side of the tournament entirely, even while their own infrastructure hosts it. It's genuinely hard to think of a stranger scenario in the history of the World Cup than a host nation building stadiums for a tournament its own national team refuses to play in. Morocco complicates that picture even further, because unlike Spain and Portugal, Morocco isn't a UEFA member at all. It belongs to the Confederation of African Football instead, and isn't bound by whatever collective position UEFA's European members decide to take. So you've got two of the three co-hosts potentially aligned with a European boycott position, and the third host nation completely outside that structure, free to continue its own preparations regardless of what Spain and Portugal decide. Reporting has noted that Morocco has stayed publicly silent through most of this controversy, continuing to quietly press ahead for what would be its first Men's World Cup as a host nation, seemingly uninterested in getting pulled into a fight that isn't really its own. FIFA, for its part, has pushed back hard against the idea that any of this represents privatizing the World Cup itself, insisting directly that nobody is selling football and that such a thing is not something FIFA would ever entertain. FIFA has also argued that opposition to the FFE plan, however widespread, doesn't represent the views of all 211 member associations, and that the consultation process around it would continue regardless of the criticism. Whether that consultation process actually produces something Europe's federations can live with, or whether this becomes yet another flashpoint dragging 2030 further into uncertainty, is genuinely still up in the air. There's also a completely separate category of controversy here that has nothing to do with logistics or governance, genuine social and political criticism specifically aimed at how Morocco is preparing to host. Reports have highlighted the culling of stray dogs taking place in Morocco ahead of the tournament, a practice that's drawn significant criticism from European commentators and animal welfare advocates. That's the kind of story that tends to generate real public backlash well beyond football circles, the same way host nation human rights and welfare concerns have dogged World Cup preparations in previous tournaments. And Spain, despite pushing hard for prestige like hosting the final, isn't exactly free of its own controversy either. There have been ongoing racism concerns connected to Spanish football specifically, going back to comments from Real Madrid's Vinicius Jr. calling out racist abuse he's faced and suggesting Spain needed to clean up its record before being fully trusted with hosting duties. Those comments drew fierce pushback from Spanish media and prominent players, who've pointed to strengthened anti-racism protocols in La Liga and cases where offenders have actually faced punishment through the courts and sporting bodies as evidence the country takes the issue seriously. Players like Dani Carvajal have specifically defended Spain's record, arguing the incidents reflect the actions of a small minority rather than anything systemic. But the criticism hasn't fully gone away, and reports have also referenced a separate FIFA disciplinary case connected to anti-Muslim chanting associated with the Spanish Federation, adding another layer of scrutiny to Spain's own suitability as a host, right at the same time Spain's federation president is out there arguing Morocco isn't equipped to be trusted with hosting the final. There's a genuine irony sitting at the heart of that dynamic, Spain positioning itself as the more prestigious, more reliable co-host, while simultaneously carrying its own unresolved disciplinary case over discriminatory chanting. Neither side of this argument is arriving at the table with entirely clean hands, which is exactly why neutral observers have found it hard to take either country's public positioning completely at face value. So pull all of these threats together and you get a genuinely remarkable list of unresolved problems facing a World Cup that's still 4 years out, a 6-country, 3-continent format nobody's fully happy with, a stadium list that isn't finalized, a final venue that's become a 3-way tug-of-war between Madrid, Barcelona, and Casablanca, a 64-team expansion plan straining an already complicated tournament further, a governance war between FIFA and UEFA that could realistically affect whether 2 of the 3 main hosts even show up, and separate serious criticism aimed at both Morocco and Spain individually on completely different grounds that has nothing to do with any of the logistics. Most World Cups accumulate this kind of controversy gradually in the months right before kickoff. This one has managed to generate almost all of it years in advance, before a single ball has been kicked, before a final stadium list even exists, and before anyone knows for certain which countries will actually field teams if the FIFA-UEFA standoff doesn't get resolved. Whether any of this actually derails the tournaments or whether it all gets smoothed over the way plenty of pre-tournament controversies eventually do is genuinely impossible to say right now. But by any measure, this is already one of the most contested build-ups to a World Cup in the competition's history, and we're still 4 years from kickoff.